The mirror in the staff washroom of the Fairmont Château Laurier told me nothing I didn't already know. I was 63 years old, and I was about to spend the evening pretending to be someone I wasn't, in a building I had walked through 100 times as an honored guest. I smoothed down the black apron, adjusted the name tag that read Margaret, a name that wasn't mine, and stared at the woman looking back. She had my eyes, but something behind them had changed over the past 6 months. Something had hardened the way frost hardens the surface of the Ottawa River in January, quiet and unforgiving. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and for 41 years I had been married to Gordon Whitfield, senior partner at one of the oldest financial advisory firms in the nation's capital. We had raised 2 children in our stone house in Rockcliffe Park, spent summers at our cottage near Wakefield, and weathered what I had always believed were the ordinary storms of a long marriage. We had stood on the steps of Parliament Hill together the night our daughter graduated from Queen's, and I had held his hand through his father's funeral and through my mother's long, slow disappearance into dementia at the care home in Canada. I had trusted him. That was the thing I kept coming back to, standing there in that borrowed uniform. I had trusted him completely. The signs had been there for months, of course. The classic ones, the ones every woman my age has heard about from friends at the bridge club or read about in magazines while waiting at the dentist. The late nights at the office that became later. The sudden interest in a new cologne he'd never worn before. Something sharp and citrusy that smelled nothing like the man I'd married. The phone that used to sit face up on the kitchen island now turned face down or carried into the washroom when it buzzed. The weekend client golf retreats at Le Chateau Montebello that somehow never appeared on the firm's billable hours. I had told myself I was being foolish. I had told myself that 63-year-old women don't get replaced. I had told myself a great many things, and I had believed none of them. What finally pushed me from suspicion into action was our accountant, Pauline, who had handled our household books for 26 years. She called me on a gray Tuesday in late October and asked, very gently, whether I had authorized the second line of credit against our cottage. I had not. I had not even known such a line existed. $87,000 had been drawn on it over the previous 18 months, in small amounts, steadily, like water seeping through a foundation. I drove home from the Byward Market that afternoon, with a bag of groceries on the passenger seat, and a stillness in my chest that frightened me more than any tears would have. I did not confront my husband that evening. I did not confront him the next evening either. Instead, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of red rose tea going cold between my hands, and I began, very quietly, to plan. The firm's annual charitable gala was 3 weeks away. It was being held, as it had been every year for 2 decades, in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Château Laurier. I had been on the organizing committee myself, back when the children were in school, and I was looking for something to do that felt useful. I knew every corner of that ballroom. I knew the kitchen layout, the service entrances, the staff room behind the coat check. I knew the catering company the hotel contracted for large events was called Maple Crown Hospitality, and I knew, because my cousin's daughter Brenda worked there as a shift supervisor, that they were always short-handed for gala season. I called Brenda the next morning. I did not tell her everything. I told her I needed a favor, a strange one, and that one day I would explain. She did not ask questions. She had gone through her own divorce 5 years earlier, and there is a kind of understanding that passes between women who have stood where I was standing, without anything needing to be said. She put me on the roster as Margaret Doucet, temporary banquet server brought in from a sister location in Gatineau for the night. I cut my hair the week before the gala. I had worn it shoulder length and silver for 15 years, the way Gordon said he liked it. I had Sylvie at the salon on Beechwood Avenue take it down to a short, practical crop and darken it to a soft brown. I traded my reading glasses for a pair with heavier black frames that I found at the Bay. I wore no jewelry. When I looked at myself the night of the gala, standing in that staff washroom with the fluorescent light humming overhead, I saw a stranger, a tired, plain woman in her 60s who might have worked banquets for 30 years, a woman nobody would look at twice. Which was, of course, precisely the point. The ballroom was magnificent, the way it always was in late November. White lilies and evergreen boughs on every table, candles flickering in hurricane lamps, the great chandeliers dimmed to a honeyed glow. 320 guests in evening dress, the men in black tie, the women in gowns I recognized from the windows of Holt Renfrew. I recognized most of the faces, too. Judge Cartwright and his wife from the Rideau Club, the Desjardins, who summered near us in Wakefield. My husband's partners and their wives, women I had sat beside at charity luncheons for 3 decades, women whose children had played with mine. Not one of them looked at me. I carried my tray of champagne flutes from the kitchen through the service door, and I moved among them like a shadow, and I understood, for perhaps the first time in my life, how completely invisible a woman in a server's apron becomes to people who have never worn one. I found my husband at a table near the dance floor. He was seated beside a woman I had never seen before. She was perhaps 30-thing arc-haired, very slim, wearing a midnight blue gown that fell from one shoulder. She had the kind of beauty that photographs well, sharp and deliberate, and she was laughing at something he had just said, her hand resting lightly on his forearm in the way a hand rests only when it has rested there many times before. My husband was laughing too, his head tipped back, in a way I had not seen him laugh in years, perhaps in a decade, perhaps longer than that. I stood very still for a moment with my tray of champagne, and I breathed through my nose the way my yoga instructor had taught me, and I did not drop the tray. That was what I counted as a victory, in that first minute. I did not drop the tray. "Madam," someone said behind me, and I moved on. I learned her name within the first half hour. One of the junior associates called out to her across the table, "Sophia, tell them about Tuscany," and my husband's hand found the small of her back, and she leaned forward and began a story about a villa outside Siena where apparently the two of them had spent 10 days in September. I had been in Halifax that week, helping my sister after her hip replacement. Gordon had told me he was at a regulatory conference in Toronto. I refilled water glasses. I cleared bread plates. I moved between the tables with my eyes lowered and my hands steady, and I listened. I heard that Sophia had joined the firm as a junior analyst 18 months ago. I heard that Gordon had been mentoring her. I heard one of the wives at the next table whisper to another, behind her napkin, that everyone knew, everyone had known for nearly a year, and wasn't it just a shame about Eleanor, poor Eleanor, who of course had no idea. Poor Eleanor. I served them their soup. I served them their salad. I refilled Gordon's wine glass from the bottle of Bordeaux he had ordered for the table, and he did not so much as glance at my face. He simply lifted his glass an inch without breaking off his conversation, and I poured, and I moved on. Halfway through the main course, a man I recognized as one of Gordon's oldest colleagues, Harrison Beaumont, tapped his water glass with a spoon and rose to his feet. He was already a little drunk. He was grinning. "I wasn't going to say anything," Harrison began, with the theatrical sigh of a man who had been planning to say something for a week, "but I think the time has come, to our Gordon, and to his lovely Sophia. I don't suppose you two are going to keep us waiting much longer, are you? When is the wedding, you old devil?" The table erupted in laughter and applause. Sophia blushed and buried her face in Gordon's shoulder. Gordon, my husband of 41 years, raised his glass and said, loud enough for half the room to hear, "All in good time, Harrison. All in good time. Some things are worth waiting for." I was standing 3 feet behind his chair holding a pitcher of ice water. Sophia looked up then, her hand drifting to the place just below her ribs, in the particular way a woman's hand drifts when she has recently become aware of what lies beneath it, and she said, soft but clear, "Well, perhaps sooner than any of us expected." The table went still for a heartbeat, and then it exploded. Glasses clinking, women reaching across to touch her wrist, Gordon beaming, Harrison roaring with laughter, calling for more champagne for the mother-to-be. Someone held out an empty glass toward me without looking. I filled it with water. My hand was perfectly steady. Inside my chest, something was happening that I could not quite name, something that felt less like breaking and more like a door being opened in a house I had lived in my whole life without knowing it was there. She was pregnant. My husband of 41 years had gotten a 32-year-old analyst pregnant, and he was going to marry her, and everyone at this table had known, and I had been served her existence across the dinner I was paying for. Because of course I was paying for it. I had paid for all of it. The cottage was in my name, inherited from my father. The Rockcliffe house had been bought with the trust my grandfather established. Half of Gordon's initial partnership buy-in, 40 years ago, had come from my mother's estate. I walked back toward the kitchen with the empty pitcher, and on the way I passed a small alcove near the service corridor, and I stopped, and I stood there for perhaps 30 seconds with my forehead against the cool plaster of the wall. Then I straightened up, and I smoothed my apron, and I went to find the hotel's head of events. Her name was Diane, and she had been running galas at the Château Laurier for longer than Sophia had been alive. I had worked with her on 3 separate fundraisers during my years on the organizing committee. When I lifted my chin and took off my heavy glasses and looked her in the eye and said quietly, "Diane, it's me. It's Eleanor Whitfield." I need 5 minutes with the microphone before the CEO's speech. Her expression did not change by so much as a flicker. She had been reading the room, I think for some time. She nodded once and she said, "Follow me, Mrs. Whitfield, we'll get you sorted." I had not prepared a speech. I had thought, over the previous 3 weeks of planning, that if the moment came I would know what to say. And standing there in that back corridor, with the muffled sound of the string quartet drifting through the walls, I found that I did. I had also not come alone. I had brought, folded inside the small zippered pocket of my apron, a thumb drive. On that thumb drive was a document prepared by the senior partner of Bouchard Levine LLP, a Montreal firm I had quietly retained 6 weeks earlier. It contained the full accounting of the $87,000 Gordon had drawn against our cottage. It contained the records of a numbered company he had established in his sole name, funded with matrimonial funds, through which he had purchased a condominium on Metcalfe Street that I had never heard of. It contained the lease agreement for that condominium, signed by Sophia Marchetti, dated 14 months ago. It contained, most damning of all, the forensic audit my lawyer's firm had commissioned on my husband's client accounts, which had uncovered a pattern of fee structures that the Ontario Securities Commission would find of considerable interest. I had not come to the Château Laurier merely to be humiliated. I had come to end something. At 9:45, the CEO of the firm, a decent man named Robert Tremblay, whom I had always liked, stepped up to the podium to deliver his remarks. Diane caught his eye from the side of the stage and murmured something to him, and he glanced over at me, and a complicated expression moved across his face. He had been at our wedding. He had been at our children's baptisms. He gave me the smallest possible nod. "Before I begin my own remarks," he said into the microphone, "I've been asked to yield the floor for a brief moment to someone who wishes to address the room. Many of you know her. I'd ask for your attention, please." I walked up those stairs to the stage in my black apron and my borrowed name tag, and I stepped to the microphone and I looked out across 320 faces, and I found my husband's. He had gone the color of wet cement. "Good evening," I said. My voice did not shake. I had been a little worried that it might. For those of you who don't recognize me in this outfit, my name is Eleanor Whitfield. Gordon Whitfield is my husband. Has been for 41 years this past June. A sound went through the ballroom that I can only describe as a single sharp intake of breath, as though 300 people had been struck simultaneously in the stomach. "I've spent the evening serving you dinner," I said. "I wanted to see something with my own eyes, and I have seen it. I wanted to hear something with my own ears, and I have heard it. I want to congratulate my husband and Miss Marchetti on their happy news, and I want to wish them every joy that honesty can bring, which in my experience is a great deal." I turned to look directly at Gordon. He had half risen from his chair. Sophia was staring at me with her mouth slightly open. "Gordon," I said, "tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock my lawyer will be serving you with divorce papers at your office. Tomorrow afternoon at 2, the Ontario Securities Commission will be receiving a rather thorough package concerning the Harrington and Delisle client accounts. The cottage is mine. The house in Rockcliffe is mine. The numbered company you set up on Metcalfe Street is now, as of Monday, also mine. Through a rather interesting matrimonial property claim, my lawyers were delighted to file. I believe Miss Marchetti will need to make other arrangements." I turned back to the room. "I'd like to thank Maple Crown Hospitality for the loan of this apron. I'd like to thank Diane and her team for their kindness this evening. And I'd like to thank every one of you who knew, and who said nothing to me, for teaching me something important about the quality of the friendships I thought I had." I unclipped the name tag that read Margaret. I set it down on the podium. The ballroom was so quiet I could hear the hiss of the candles. "Enjoy the rest of your evening," I said. "I certainly intend to." I walked out of the Fairmont Château Laurier through the main doors, not the service entrance, and I stood for a moment on Wellington Street looking across at the lit-up Parliament buildings, and I felt the cold November air on my face, and I understood that I had not, in fact, lost everything. I had lost something that had already been gone for a long time. What I had gained was harder to name, but I could feel it, the way you feel the ground under your feet after a long illness in bed. Steadiness. A sense of my own weight in the world. My daughter Claire picked me up at the curb in her Subaru. She had driven in from Kingston that afternoon. I had told her everything the week before, and she had wept, and then she had helped me pack a suitcase for the Lord Elgin Hotel, where I had booked a room for the next 3 nights. She did not ask me how it had gone. She looked at my face, and she reached across and squeezed my hand, and she pulled out into traffic. The rest happened the way these things happen. Slowly, and then all at once. Gordon was suspended from the firm within the week, pending the regulatory review. The review found what my forensic accountants had found, and more. He surrendered his license the following spring, in exchange for avoiding criminal charges. The divorce took 11 months and cost him considerably more than he had expected, because my lawyers were better than his, and because he had given me, without knowing it, a great deal of ammunition over the course of that long year. Sophia Marchetti left the firm, and Ottawa, before the baby was born. I heard, through the particular grapevine that binds together women of a certain age in a certain kind of city, that she had gone to Calgary, and that Gordon had followed her for a time, and that it had not lasted. I found I did not much care whether it lasted or not. I sold the Rockcliffe house in the spring. It was too large for one person, and it had too many ghosts. I bought a smaller place in New Edinburgh, a brick semi-detached on a quiet street, with a garden in the back, and I planted tomatoes and sweet peas. And I learned, slowly, that I liked my own company better than I had known. My son flew up from Vancouver for my 64th birthday. Claire came in from Kingston with her husband and the twins. We had dinner on the back patio in the long June light, and I looked around the table at my children and my grandchildren, and I thought about the woman who had stood in front of that washroom mirror in a borrowed apron, and I wanted to tell her something. I wanted to tell her that she had been right to do what she did, that she had been right to wait, and to plan, and to choose her moment, and to walk through those main doors with her head up. I want to tell you something too, if you have stayed with me this long. I want to tell you that the women in your life who smile and say nothing are not always the ones who have nothing to say. Sometimes the quietest woman in the room is simply the one who has not yet decided when she will speak. When she does speak, I hope for your sake that you have been kind to her. Because a woman who has spent 41 years being underestimated learns things. She learns patience, and she learns accounting, and she learns the layout of every ballroom in her city. And when the moment comes, she does not drop the tray. You are the author of your own ending. Nobody else gets to write it for you. Not the man who promised to love you. Not the friends who watched and stayed silent. Not the young woman in the midnight blue gown who thought she had won something she had not, in fact, won at all. Write it yourself. Take your time, and when you are ready, walk through the front doors,